Welcome, everybody. Happy Ratification Week. So we are going to look at the ratification of the United States Constitution, not an amendment, the actual structure of Constitution. And we're going to walk through this. The class is 35 minutes long, and we would love to have your questions. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I am going to be helping Nick with these great questions that come through the chat and Q&A. So let's get started. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our top scholar today, Nick. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody?
Yes. Hi, I'm Nicholas Mosvick. I am one of our senior fellows in constitutional content. And as I always share, I have both a PhD in American history and a law degree. So I am supposed to be a constitutional expert. Supposed to.
Supposed to. You are.
That's right.
He is a great constitutional expert. And I will say, we always like to play Stump the Nick in our classes. So if you have a question that's on topic, so let's make sure we always stay on topic, but about ratification and you've been pondering and wondering it, you can absolutely put that in the chat. So let's start off, Nick, with a really simple question. When did ratification happen, and what exactly is the ratification process and the ratification debates? Can you kind of give us some framework and foundation to start with?
Yeah, I think we talked about this before we got started, just kind of setting the context for everything that happened. And the word you use that's really important here is process, right? It's not a single moment, but actually is almost a year that it takes for this process to unfold. Because once the Constitution is written and signed, so it's signed on September 17th, which we talked about last week, it's now given to the people to ratify. And the way that it's ratified is through what are called state ratifying conventions. In other words, the states put together their own constitutional conventions to consider whether or not to accept and ratify the Constitution that was signed on September 17th. And part of that context you have to remember, right, is this is a surprise. So people know something's going on in Philadelphia, but the convention is secret. The proceedings are secret. There are no breaking news. There is no insiders in the newspapers who are getting things out there. According to the public, at least what they know is that the Articles of Confederation are being reconsidered, but to be amended, right? And that amendment process, as we recall, requires the unanimous consent of all states. Well, what does the Constitution do? Well, according to the Constitution, ratification requires 9 of 13 states, supermajority of 2/3, right? Not a unanimous approval of all states, right? So that's really important, right? Is they've also created new rules for ratification as part of the Constitution, and they presented them to states. So you have to remember the surprise. And that the first thing that happens, the first people to speak in the newspapers and in public about the Constitution, the strongest voices, are those who are criticizing it. It's the Anti-Federalists, the critics of the Constitution, who are first to get their voices out there. And that is when supporters of the Constitution, the Federalists as we call them, realize that they have to mount a campaign of their own to defend and get this Constitution passed.
Yeah, and Eddie asked a really good question. So it's the idea, and the question was, what part was secret? So they knew they went to Philadelphia to fix the governing document we were living under, the Articles of Confederation, but they didn't know how much fixing. And when I say that with air quotes, that means they took it and threw it out and rewrote it from scratch. And so they heard things, but they didn't really know what it was. So on September 17th, it takes 2 days to be put in the newspaper because the print process took that long, but it is then printed and then in the Pennsylvania packet 2 days on September 19th. So that's the first time that people got to see the new proposed government that many of these people said, here's the best we could do. Here's our good idea of how to build the government. And so that's what's new. And then it goes back, Nick, is this right? It goes back to each state to decide if that state is for it or against it. So how quickly were the debates started once the kind of word was out that it existed?
I believe the first conventions start at the end of the year in 1787. So a handful of states do ratify rather quickly and without much debate. Some of those are the New England states. There's not a protracted debate, for instance, in Connecticut. Rhode Island, we'll get to, doesn't really take part, and they don't ratify until they're pressured to after the government's even constituted. But it depends on states, because New York, for instance, whose governor is an anti-federalist, George Clinton, he waits to the new year to even consider putting a convention together. So New York's convention doesn't even start until June 1788. So they wait, in part because they know they have a lot of opposition. They think that they're going to have the votes to actually reject the Constitution. So they wait and follow their process. Massachusetts doesn't really start to the beginning of the year, and Massachusetts is in fact one of the most contentious scenes of debate over the new Constitution. So is Pennsylvania, right here in Pennsylvania. So it depends on state by state. Some, as I said, are rather quick to accept the document. I mentioned Connecticut, Delaware is another one. New Jersey is pretty quick, but there are a lot of states where there are protracted battles because there are some very strong anti-federalist groups within those states, or factions. And Pennsylvania is one of them. So my point was that the public debate actually starts first, right? So even before it gets to the states ratifying conventions, it's already beginning to be debated, right? You're seeing speeches, you're seeing newspaper editorials, and everyone is getting geared up for these ratification debates. And as we'll talk about, right, this is precisely because the supporters of the new document, the Federalists, know that it's going to be a close battle. So there's no assumption in September 1787 or in that end of that year that this is just going to be quickly ratified and it's not going to be hard. I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be a struggle.
So I meant to send this to everybody in the chat. So a couple like clarifying questions, but I wanted to ask everybody, and I'll put it in the chat again. I'm sorry, I just sent it to Marcy. Does anybody know who the first state was to ratify? Any guesses? Smaller state? And then I'm going to ask you guys think about it. Who was the first state to ratify the Constitution? It is on their license plate. Okay, nice job in there. Nice chat. Let's see if anybody else can get it. Yes, good job, guys. Nice job. So, okay, so I think that's really interesting that you said that, Nick. It's not a done deal. The answer, very good. You guys are doing a good job. It's Delaware. Nice answers in the chat.
I mentioned it without trying to say that, yes.
Yeah, I know you did. And I was like, oh, he left it for me. Thank you. So it wasn't a done deal that they come out with this document, and already there's two groups, a pro group and a con group. So the pro group is the Federalists, and the con, they don't want it, is the Anti-Federalists. And we're going to break down why. They both had good arguments on both sides, which is what we like to teach here. Even in history, we have good arguments on both sides. Some states were right away, like Delaware, the first state to ratify, but other states waited and didn't think. Now, here's a question that we had in the Q&A that I thought was a really interesting question. If we talk about we the people, and we know that we the people consisted in this room of wealthy white male landowners, how was that different for ratification, or was it even different for ratification? Were the people voting on it in the ratification groups still just the same kind of level of people who wrote we the people? Because we were talking about this 2 weeks ago, like what was the meaning of popular sovereignty, and that idea that we the people had a voice. It doesn't always mean all the people at different time periods in America. So Eddie asked that question. Was it only the privileged white males that joined the convention? Could they vote?
Yeah, so that actually gets to something we wanted to talk about anyways, which is the significant difference in the makeup of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And so when it comes to state ratifying conventions, no, it's not just privilege in the sense of elite or land holding or what we might call gentry, right? Landed folk, right? There are a lot of middling in representatives who may have been artisans or even farmers. and a lot of them were anti-federalists. And this is one of the important divides between the two groups, is that Federalists are mostly people in the city. A lot of them are fairly well off. So their interests are related to a strong national government that can do what? What is the thing that they're trying to solve, right? Well, as we've talked about in previous classes, it's to have a treaty-worthy nation that's capable of making war, of protecting itself, of taxing when it needs to, of protecting the economy, ensuring a national economy, in growth, right? Growth both in the economy and literal growth. Growth as a country. The only way to expand the borders is to be able to have a strong central government. So they're interested in that. Anti-federalists tend to be more rural. And what happens with people who tend to be more rural? Well, they don't always have formal educations. So you hear this from anti-federalists, where they sometimes are self-deprecating in the sense that they say, look, I'm not as schooled or as educated as, I don't know, Gouverneur Morris, right? Pick your Federalists, but I understand the Constitution, right? It's supposed to be a simple document that could be read by anybody, right? And so these people, the anti-federalists, right, they tend to be more rural, and they tend to have a different set of interests. Especially the poorer and the more working class they are, so we would use that term now, they didn't necessarily at the time, laborers they may have said, right? They were interested in things like land and economic reform, things that they thought were more likely to happen the more democratic the government was. And they assumed that the most democratic governments would be the local and state governments, not the federal government. So to them, this removed federal government wasn't much different from what they had had before in some respects. They didn't necessarily trust it. They thought it had too much power and that it was insufficiently democratic. So I think my point there is to say is you can actually connect some of the most radical critiques of the Constitution to the fact that a lot of anti-federalists are not actually that wealthy. And so it's funny because Kerry has showed you the dissenters. The dissenters are actually all wealthy. Edmund Randolph.
I was going to say, here's our outliers.
Yeah, they're outliers. Randolph becomes a Federalist. He becomes a supporter of the Constitution, and in fact becomes Washington's Attorney General later on in the Washington administration. Elbridge Gerry changes his tune in some respects too, and becomes a very vocal critic of his Massachusetts Federalists later in his life. And George Mason is, I think, the very definition of an elite anti-federalist. And what do we mean by an elite anti-federalist? Well, elite anti-federalists, if we're just giving a very simple, broad definition, they tended to agree with Federalists that aristocracy wasn't necessarily bad, that sort of these upper men, these gentried folk, could talk amongst themselves. And they, as a result, didn't necessarily trust the people either. So they weren't bothered by the anti-democratic character of some of the Constitution. What they were bothered by was the lack of a Bill of Rights and perhaps too strong of a national government, right? This is a crucial difference between someone like Mason and some of the anti-federalists we know quite well, like Brutus and Federal Farmer, who, again, the less elite they get as a voice, the more middle class or even laboring, the more they tend to actually emphasize the fact that the Constitution wasn't democratic enough, right? So it's actually important to see that variance amongst the leaders and those who are speaking, right? So there's a difference between George Mason and Brutus, as we'll get to.
And I think this is a great question that came in. Let me see who asked it, because it was a really good one. So Lainey asked, and this is why I put up the dissenters, because you were talking about, like, how does this all start? So they get to the end of the Constitutional Convention, they have this document, but not everybody is for it. So that winds up having two groups, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and people move back and forth between them. But how does this kind of hubbub get started about maybe we shouldn't ratify this document? And it's with the dissenters. The dissenters, and Nick, you can kind of go through who they are, what they do. But Lainey's question was, how did everybody find out about it? I referenced the Pennsylvania packet, which was 2 days later. It was first printed in the Pennsylvania packet. But, they didn't have Twitter. They didn't have they couldn't call each other and be like, hey, did you hear about that thing that happened in Philadelphia? So what do the dissenters do? And then how does the word start spreading across the states at this time to get everybody excited and talking about it? And then one more question back into that is, how much were normal people talking about it? Like the me's of the group, would have been talking about it too?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think one way of answering it is that it works similar to how during the revolution, the rhetoric and ideology of the revolution spread amongst laboring and middle class people. And yes, some people could, a lot of people could read more than you think. So literacy rates were actually not that low. And so people could get newspapers. The thing is that newspapers were almost all printed in large cities. So if you weren't in Philadelphia or New York City, it's a little harder to get a newspaper sometimes. That's where they were printed. So if you're in the city, yes, you might read a newspaper. But what might also happen is that somebody in your small town may get a copy and then read the copy in the town square. You would see that for sure. Or you'd see speeches given where they would simply read it. They would spend a half hour and they would read this new document for everybody. The other place you might talk about it is frankly in bars or taverns. The same place where revolutionary ideology was spread, people are talking about it there too, right? It's a very interesting question to say the extent to which normal people talked about it, but I think they did. There are certainly scholars who work on this very question, and it's an important one. But the Constitution was of interest to everybody. It was of interest to free Blacks, to Native Americans, to women. It is not just the interests of the elite. And in fact, that's kind of what's important about what happens during and after the revolution, is that actually everyone's interested in it. And therefore, it's not just the men and the women, the room at Philadelphia, who have control over what it means or how it's understood, which is actually, I think, what's kind of crucial about ratification itself, is now they give the document away, they've written it, and they understand, ultimately, I think, okay, now the people have to decide whether or not we've convinced them. And that's nerve-wracking because they don't really have control anymore. Yes, we'll get to the Federalist Papers, you can put these things out there, but you're hoping people read it and they're convinced by it. But the truth is, it's now within the people to read and understand it. And they are, yes, they are going to be interested in it. And I do think you see a lot of letters and rhetoric from, as I noted, people who we would consider more middle class or labor, who are very interested in what the new Constitution would mean for them.
Yeah, so I think it's so exciting to think about like this new
and
government.
One more thing, sorry, Kerry.
No, go right ahead.
I can't forget this because Jeff would appreciate it. That's our president, Jeff Rosen. He would appreciate if I mentioned an anti-federalist who was a woman, although not everybody I think necessarily knew she was a woman. And that was the famous James Otis, his niece, Mercy Warren Otis, who wrote a book about the revolution, but also published writings that were critical of the Constitution. She was a leading anti-federalist. So yes, that's an exception, but they weren't all white men either.
Yeah, and I love to bring in like Elizabeth Powell, who's a Philadelphian. She was a Philadelphia woman, and she was unbelievably interested during the entire process and had a ton of opinions on it because it affected her. So I think that's awesome to bring up next. Great one, good reference. Can we, I know we have a lot of diving into, and Craig definitely wants us to talk about Yeats and Martin Luther, or Luther Martin, I always backwards his name. And you know how I love those guys, but we do need to go over, okay, you briefly talked about the Anti-Federalists, but also, let's talk about the Federalists. Can you kind of give us who were the Federalists? Why were they so pro the Constitution? And one more clarifying question from Eddie. At the ratification debates, the only people who could vote for or against it, were they only white males, or was there any other kind of stretching of who had voice and agency at those ratifying conventions?
Yeah, so that's a couple questions there. I'm going to start with
Sorry.
the Federalists themselves. No, it's fine. I mean, you get 2 and 3 part questions. There's nothing wrong with that. Scholars have to be ready for that. So as you can see here, right, the leading Federalists: Madison, James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Day, John Dickinson, James Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris. What a lot of them had in common, not all of them, but a lot of them were members of the army and leading figures during the Revolution. We talked about this in last class, but the reason this is important is exactly why they thought we needed to have a strong national government. They had witnessed what happens under a weak central government. And they thought we had such rising crises. Of course, there's Shays' rebellions, but that's not the only one. Frankly, the crisis of the ability to make treaties and to work with other countries. They thought that there was such a growing crisis, it would break up the country and it would be irreconcilable. So from their viewpoint, this also included Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was critical of parts of the Constitution, and he thought it may have made too strong of a government. But the way Franklin viewed it, and I think this is important from the Federalist lens, was, look, this isn't a perfect document, but it's probably the best we're going to get out of a convention. It's a pretty good document. In fact, there's some very good things about it. And we need this now. We need to rally around this because this is an improvement. And we need this improvement because we have to be able to deal with the crises we have now. Alexander Hamilton viewed it the same way. Hamilton, rather famously, I think now that people know more about Mr. Hamilton, showed up at Philadelphia, put out ideas that were considered radical, like essentially having an elected king, was then not at the convention for very long after that. He was pretty critical of the document too, but for the exact opposite reasons of anti-federalists. He thought it wasn't strong enough. But yet, at the same time, like Franklin, he had to say, look, there's some compromises in here, but this is the best thing we're getting, and it's good. And we need to defend it because we need this new government, right? So that's the Federalist persuasion, right? We have to understand it that, right? I don't think it's that they thought it was a perfect document. I think that they were pretty satisfied with it and thought we needed it, right? The question about who was at ratification conventions, I don't know from my own understanding that there were any non-white representatives, but the answer to that also would be, is with when we talk about voting and other things, it depends on the state, because who's at a convention is really no different than who can be a representative in a state, right? And it already depended at the time, right? So it would be possible, at least it should have been possible in states where in which, for instance, free blacks were allowed to vote. I just don't know of any representative convention did so. New Jersey did allow women to vote, but I don't think there were any women who were representing the convention at the time. So it didn't mean that they weren't interested, but it does mean that yes, as far as I know, that's how that worked. So again, like that also says that the ratification process it's still the people's representatives at these state conventions too, right? So that's how the people have influence. They're still not directly affirming or declining the Constitution.
I do feel like those ratification conventions do get a little confusing because we never ever really spend a ton of time on what the heck is this, you know, but it always reminds me of the way like Vermont votes for things, you know, come together as a quorum, has people, and then talks it through. But as we dive through this kind of process, you know, going back to Lainey's question is like, how did they get the word out and how did people find out more about it? And one of the big ways is with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, the written pieces, and these are in newspapers, right, Nick? They're mostly New York newspapers, but what were they going up and down the coast as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And a lot of them are in New York because this was one of the Federalist advantages, is that the Federalists controlled nearly all the newspapers. And when I say that, I mean, we're talking
you get what you want printed.
90%. It's a pretty high number that are Federalists because in some states, the Anti-Federalists can't even get their essays printed. They can't even get them printed, right? So no one can even hear about them. So they have to find it another way. But it's also a limiting factor, right? Because it also means that the Federalist Papers aren't going to be read everywhere necessarily unless they're reprinted, right? So they can get reprinted in other newspapers across the country. But the Federalist Papers, for instance, mostly start as just being printed in the New York papers. Part of that is that, as I noted, New York has a lot of anti-federalists. Its governor is an anti-federalist. So the Federalists are pretty worried about New York actually rejecting the Constitution. And they're not wrong to be, because they very nearly do reject the Constitution. So where it's also printed has something to do with where they're also worried about convincing people to accept this Constitution. I did also see Karen's question about the fancy ways in which—
I love this question. This is my favorite question so far this year.
Well, it's actually a good question, though, because we kind of talked about this a little, but it's worth emphasizing again, right? Which is that this is, again, part of the divide between anti-federalists and federalists. At least middle class and laboring anti-federalists, right? Is the elite conversation between federalists and anti-federalists. Part of it, as I noted, right, is that they agree in some respects that some anti-democratic things are good, because the mob can't be trusted. The people can only be trusted so much, right? And writing with references to antiquity and driving those ancient ideas, right? We talk about this all the time with the founders and the framers, right? They have a shared language from their education, right? You got an elite education, you know, when you speak a particular way, right? And so you write that and it reflects, right? In other words, you almost are writing for that audience too, right? You know that people understand this person is elite because I can tell he's educated and a respectable, honorable person, right? That's actually a crucial difference between them and some anti-federalists who purposely write more for the common person, right? Because that's their audience, is to say, hey, I know actually a lot of the common people, my neighbors, they're not sure about this Constitution. So I'm speaking for them too. And so I don't have to speak as much about some of these older ideas, or maybe a more highfalutin way of speaking, because I'm actually trying to reach other people, right? So my answer to that, right, the short of that is, the reason for that language sometimes actually has to do with who the intending audience is.
So that's a really interesting point. So the Federalists, in a nutshell, are saying, ratify this Constitution. Yes, it's creating a federal government, and that is worrisome for some people, but we need that to be able to survive. And we look at the state conventions on the screen and say, each state is having this discussion and this debate. The anti-federalists are coming back and saying, no, we'll lose power. It'll be worse than before. This is dangerous. And we, the common people, don't want to be stepped on by the big government again. That's kind of like debate going back and forth. And so I know Dickinson writes, you know, when he starts and begin to kind of join in this conversation and write in this conversation, he talks about having conversations and that this is good and healthy for America. And he tries to, is it wrong of me to think that Dickinson feels like he's trying to come in and sound like the common man, but for the Federalist Party?
I mean, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, since, you know, they needed that voice a little bit, because one thing you learn from teaching, especially Madison's Federalist essays, every time I taught the Federalist Papers, I find people find Hamilton easier to read than Madison. Madison speaks like somebody who's very well educated. Hamilton does too, but he also speaks like somebody who, frankly, as his life story suggests, right, had to struggle to get to that point. Madison less so. I think you do see that, right? Dickinson has a different background. Dickinson has a Quaker background. He has had a lot of time in small meetings with common people, right? And a different way of doing politics. So again, I think, yeah, there's something to that. And I don't think, thinking of Dickinson that way, this is true. This is a problem for the Federalists, right? They need enough people who can also convince more common folks that they're right. Now, that's the other thing they have going for them. There's this person, to not forget, that everybody loves. And he's going to be the president if this Constitution fails. And that's George Washington. He doesn't have to say anything because he's the hero. He's the hero of everybody. He's the most famous American in the world. Even the British, who we just beat, are happy to honor him in some ways. You think about that, right? Somebody so famous, the person that they just beat, who would have gladly executed him, will now celebrate him, right? So that's a huge advantage for them, is they have George Washington. And the other one is that the thing people don't like is the Articles of the Confederation. What they're really trying to convince some common people of is to shift the grounds of debate. Anti-Federalists wanted to be about the Constitution that's being presented and say, look at all the problems with this. Look at how aristocratic this is. There's so much potential tyranny here, right? Whether it's the president or the Senate or the Supreme Court, we see the problem of growing power all over the place. The Federalists are saying, hey, we know what life out of the Articles of Confederation was like. It's bad. It doesn't work. We all agree on that. And this is better than the Articles of Confederation. Can you see the difference between the two, right? One of those was a harder debate for them to win, and they knew it.
I love that. So I'm obsessed with Yates. I know Craig brought it up earlier. And one of the things that
Robert,
Yates says,
you mean?
Yeah. And one of these things that they say, the anti-federalists say, and Yates is one of them, says, this is the best marketing ploy ever.
Yep.
So basically, like, Hamilton and Madison are like brilliant marketers, and they're saying, like, it was so bad, guys. Don't forget how bad articles were. We had Shays Rebellion, and would like almost use it to scare people.
Yep.
But that was their marketing ploy, and then to utilize GW, George Washington, as like, look who we have.
Right.
You know, so it's brilliant. So when we talk about that question about like, how did they communicate this? How did they get that out? Some of the same marketing tools people would use today, but the avenues were different. Now, there's a linchpin in all of this. What makes everything go towards the Constitution? What's kind of the big deal that they make around the Constitution to make sure it gets ratified?
You mean the Federalists?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
and I'm gonna wait. Let's do it as a guess. You guys,
okay.
What was the big linchpin? And Eddie, I'll share what Shays Rebellion is in a second. I'll give you some links in the chat. But what was the deal that the Federalists make and promise that they will add it right away?
Okay.
Sorry,
I see where you're going with this. Okay. Yeah. At first I was like, I think we just talked about the thing that they're selling them on. Yeah. Well, the first thing we have to say is to remind everyone that at this moment in 1788, a lot of these state conventions were very close. And Massachusetts was the first state convention to do something called, we would call it qualified ratification. What I mean by that is they said, look, or conditional. They said, look, we're going to ratify, but we're going to do so on the condition that you are going to consider amendments, right? And amendments, what are the amendments about? Two things, right? Rights and powers. We talk about, we'll get to the Bill of Rights. They're not really, we're not quite to that debate yet, but they're saying, we think this thing's going to get ratified. It's really close, but we want to make a deal. We're negotiating. So Massachusetts does that in February 1788. You see Pennsylvania do that too. Pennsylvania, the Anti-Federalists, they call themselves the dissenters. They publish a list of demands around the time that the state ratifies. And it's a large list, and it's essentially a Bill of Rights to say, look at all these rights that aren't being protected. Your right to a jury trial, right? All these types of things, right? That they're saying, they're listing all the rights that need to be considered. New York follows suit, right? New York, as I said, they had an anti-Federalist majority. It was very close. It was hard work. What worked in the Federalist favor? Well, New York started to realize it didn't matter because New Hampshire was about to ratify, and they were going to be the 9th state. They did the math, and they said, okay, what are we going to do? We have to conditionally ratify, and we have to kind of send them the list of demands and say, look, we want to have a Bill of Rights. Virginia would do the same thing. Virginia was very close. Patrick Henry led a emotional, exhausting attack on the Constitution. Madison had to go there. Madison was at that convention, is the defender of the new Constitution, fighting with Patrick Henry. These were the states, right? And New York sends out a letter after they do this, and it's called a circular letter, and they go to other states that had put out these conditional ratifications, and they say, we should ask for a second constitutional convention. And why? So that we can amend it, so we can limit the power more, and we can put in rights protections. And Madison and other Federalists say, yeah, we can't have that happen. That would be really bad. We have no idea where that will go. We're just going to agree to do this Bill of Rights. We're going to do it soon, and we're going to stop this debate right there, right? That's why they're going to agree with it, because they didn't want to do a Bill of Rights, but ultimately they had to concede because the possibility of these other things was a lot worse.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wanted to go back and spend another hot, sweaty summer in Philadelphia.
Well, Millington Smith did.
Yeah. So real quick wrap up, the Constitution is signed on September 17, 1787. It is then given back to the states to the ratifying conventions to be ratified or not. It is a neck and neck battle, exciting, everybody's talking about it, everybody's engaged. During the Constitutional Convention at the end, these three gentlemen, we lovingly refer to as the dissenters, Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason, say, you know what, we shouldn't do this yet. This document is not right. One of the many things they're complaining about is a lack of a Bill of Rights. The battle for the Constitution goes on for about a year through the ratification process. There starts and stops, complete freezes, and then jumps again. And then at the very end, the Federalists, who were pro-Constitution, make a deal and say, you know what, you ratify this thing, we'll get you a Bill of Rights. And that's Madison that does that. It was a strong lead. And how quickly does it go from ratification to amending with a Bill of Rights, Nick, for our last and final wrap up?
Yeah, so the ninth state, as I mentioned, New Hampshire, that's June 21st, 1788. I knew that because it's my birthday, so tie-in. And so that ends basically the process, although North Carolina and Rhode Island, they don't ratify until after the new government starts. Rhode Island holds out till 1790, in fact. The Bill of Rights actually does not get ratified until December 1791. So it takes over 2 years to get ratified from September 1789, when the Senate passes most of Madison's pro-optative right, or they actually reject some of his offered Bill of Rights, send them to the states, but it takes over 2 years. So it's actually a long time.
But that's a lot of amendments. 10 amendments. It still feels like a lot.
10 amendment, but they do take their time, so it doesn't happen right away. And part of the reason for that is, frankly, the Anti-Federalists, they weren't happy with it. A lot of them were like, what is this? This isn't what we wanted. This is a bunch of individual rights, and we wanted a less powerful central government. So they were unhappy with it as well.
Yeah, so we have a new Constitution. Not everybody's happy, but we keep trugging along. So thank you, everybody. That was a whirlwind tour of the ratification process, and there is so many more things to read on it. And again, like Nick said, pick up a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist. I feel like everybody reads the Federalist, so I'm going to do a shout out. Read an Anti-Federalist paper. If you need any help finding them, let us know. But we want to thank you so much for this great class. We want to make sure that you come join us again, and we'll see you next time in class. Thank you, Nick.
All right, thank you. Bye.